Chapter 25. The time had come for that which made Quinta and every other boy shudder to think of, the casus boio operation, which would purify a boy and prepare him to become a father of many sons. They knew it was coming, but when it came it was without warning. One day as the sun reached the noontime position, one of the Contango's assistants gave what seemed to be only a routine order for a CAFO to line up in the compound, which the boys did as quickly as usual. But Quinta felt a twinge of fear when the Contango himself came from his hut, as he rarely did at midday, and walked before them. "Hold out your photos," he commanded. They hesitated, not believing, or wanting to believe, what they had heard. "Now!" he shouted. Slowly and shyly they obeyed, each keeping his eyes on the ground as he reached inside his loincloth. Working their way from either end of the line, the Contango's assistants wrapped around the head of each boy's photo a short length of cloth spread with a green paste made of a pounded leaf. "Soon your photos will have no feeling," the Contango said, ordering them back into their huts. Huddled inside, ashamed and afraid of what would happen next, the boys waited in silence until about mid-afternoon, when again they were ordered outside, where they stood watching as a number of men from Jafur, the fathers, brothers, and uncles who had come before, and others, filed in through the gate. Amaro was among them, but this time Quinta pretended that he didn't see his father. The men formed themselves into a line facing the boys and chanted together, "This thing to be done also has been done to us, as to the forefathers before us, so that you also will become, all of us men together." Then the Contango ordered the boys back into their huts once again. Night was falling when they heard many drums suddenly begin to pound just outside the jujuo. Ordered out of their huts, they saw bursting through the gate about a dozen leaping, shouting, cankering dancers. In leafy branch costumes and bark masks, they sprang about brandishing their spears among the terrified boys, and then, just as abruptly as they had appeared, were gone. Almost numb with fear, the boys now heard and followed dumbly the Contango's order to seat themselves close together with their backs against the jujuo's bamboo fence. The fathers, uncles, and older brothers stood nearby, this time chanting, "You soon will return to home, and to your farms, and in time you will marry, and life everlasting will spring from your loins." One of the Contango's assistants called out one boy's name. As he got up, the assistant motioned him behind a long screen of woven bamboo. Quinta couldn't see or hear what happened after that, but a few moments later the boy reappeared, with a blood-stained cloth between his legs. Staggering slightly, he was half carried by the other assistant back to his place along the bamboo fence. Another boy's name was called, then another, and finally, Quinta Kinti. Quinta was petrified, but he made himself get up and walk behind the screen. Inside were 4 men, one of whom ordered him to lie down on his back. He did so. His shaking legs wouldn't have supported him any longer anyway. The men then leaned down, grasped him firmly, and lifted his thighs upward. Just before closing his eyes, Quinta saw the Contango bending over him with something in his hands. Then he felt the cutting pain. It was even worse than he thought it would be, though not as bad as it would have been without the numbing paste. In a moment he was bandaged tightly, and an assistant helped him back outside, where he sat, weak and dazed, alongside the others who had already been behind the screen. They didn't dare to look at one another, but the thing they had feared above all else had now been done. As the photos of the CAFO began healing, a general air of jubilation rose within the jujuo. for gone forever was the indignity of being mere boys in body as well as in mind. Now they were very nearly men, and they were boundless in their gratitude and reverence for the Kintango. And he, in turn, began to see Kunta's Kafo with different eyes. The old, wrinkled, gray-haired elder, whom they had slowly come to love, was sometimes seen even to smile now. And very casually, when talking to the Kafo, he or his assistants would say, "You men," and to Kunta and his mates. It seemed as unbelievable as it was beautiful to hear. Soon afterward, the 4th new moon arrived, and 2 or 3 members of Kunta's Kafo at the Kintango's personal order began to leave the Jujuo each night and trot all the way to the sleeping village of Jafur, where they would slip like shadows into their own mothers' storehouses, steal as much couscous, dried meats, and millet as they could carry, and then race back with it to the Jujuo, where it was gleefully cooked the next day. "To prove yourselves smarter than all women, even your mother," the Kintango had told them. But that next day, of course, those boys' mothers would boast to their friends about how they had heard their sons prowling and had lain awake listening with pride. There was a new feeling now in the evenings at the Jujuo. Nearly always, Kunta's Kafo would squat in a semicircle around the Kintango. Most of the time he remained as stern in manner as before, but now he talked to them not as bumbling little boys, but as young men of his own village. Sometimes he spoke to them with the qualities of manhood, chief among which, after fearlessness, was total honesty in all things. And sometimes he spoke to them about the forefathers. Worshipful regard was a duty owed by the living to those who dwelled with Allah, he told them. He asked each boy to name the ancestor he remembered best. Kunta named his grandma Yesa, and the Kintango said that each of the ancestors the boys had named, as was the way of ancestors, was petitioning Allah in the best interests of the living. Another evening the Kintango told them how in one's village every person who lived there was equally important to that village, from the newest baby to the oldest elder. As new men, they must therefore learn to treat everyone with the same respect and, as the foremost of their manhood duties, to protect the welfare of every man, woman, and child in Jafur as they would their own. "When you return home," said the Kintango, "you will begin to serve Jafur as its eyes and ears. You will be expected to stand guard over the village, beyond the gates as lookouts for Tubob and other savages, and in the fields as sentries to keep the crops safe from scavengers. You will also be charged with the responsibility of inspecting the women's cooking pots, including those of your own mothers, to make sure they are kept clean, and you will be expected to reprimand them most severely if any dirt or insects are found inside." The boys could hardly wait to begin their duties. Though all but the oldest of them were still too young to dream of the responsibilities they would assume when they reached the 4th Kafo, they knew that some day, as men of 15 to 19 reigns, they would be appointed to the important job of carrying messages, like the young man who had brought them word of the Moro's visit, between Jafur and other villages. It would have been hard for Kunta's Kafo to imagine such a thing, but those old enough to be messengers longed for nothing more than to stop being messengers. When they reached the 5th Kafo at 20 reigns, they would graduate to really important work, assisting the village elders as emissaries and negotiators in all dealings with other villages. Men of Amoro's age, over 30, rose gradually in rank and responsibility with each passing reign until they themselves acquired the honored status of elders. Kunta had often proudly watched Amoro sitting on the edges of the council of elders and looked forward to the day when his father would enter the inner circle of those who would inherit the mantle of office from such revered leaders as the Kintango when they were called to Allah. It was no longer easy for Kunta and the others to pay attention as they should to everything the Kintango said. It seemed impossible to them that so much would have happened in the past 4 moons, and that they were really about to become men. The past few days seemed to last longer than the moons that preceded them, but finally, with the 4th moon high and full in the heavens, the Contango's assistants ordered the Kafo to line up shortly after the evening meal. Was this the moment for which they had waited? Kunta looked around for their fathers and brothers, who would surely be there for the ceremony. They were nowhere to be seen. And where was the Contango? His eyes searched the compound and found him, standing at the gate of the Jujuo. Just as he swung it open wide, turned to them and called out, "Men of Jafur, return to your village." For a moment they stood rooted. Then they rushed up whooping and grabbed and hugged their Contango and his assistants, who pretended to be offended by such impertinence. 4 moons before, as the hood was being lifted from his head in this very compound, Kunta would have found it difficult to believe that he would be sorry to leave this place, or that he would come to love the stern old man who stood before them on that day, but he felt both emotions now. Then his thoughts turned homeward, and he was racing and shouting with the others out the gate and down the path to Jafur. They hadn't gone very far before, as if upon some unspoken signal, their voices were stilled and their pace slowed by the thoughts they all shared, each in his own way, of what they were leaving behind, and of what lay ahead of them. This time, they didn't need the stars to find their way. Are you enjoying this reading so far? Welcome to Right Here Audio, the group run by students for students who wish they had someone to read academic literature to them. We read content for anyone who has a hard time reading by themselves. This includes persons with blindness, dyslexia, ADHD, and anyone else who could use some support. Do you have anything you would like us to read for you? Comment down below and we'll get started. For those of you who have supported us since day 1, we are so grateful for your support. And if you're new or haven't subscribed yet, join our small community dedicated to increasing accessibility one small step at a time. Now, let's get back to our reading. Chapter 26. "Ai! Ai!" The women's happy shrieks rang out, and the people were rushing from their huts, laughing, dancing, and clapping their hands as Kunta's Kafo and those who had turned 15 and become 4th Kafo while they were away at the Jujuo strode in through the village gate at the break of dawn. The new men walked slowly, with what they hoped was dignity, and they didn't speak or smile, at first. When he saw his mother running toward him, Kunta felt like dashing to meet her, and he couldn't stop his face from lighting up, but he made himself continue walking at the same measured pace. Then Binta was upon him, arms around his neck, hands caressing his cheeks, tears welling in her eyes, murmuring his name. Kunta permitted this only briefly before he drew away, being now a man, but he made it seem as if he did so only to get a better look at the yowling bundle cradled snugly in the sling across her back. Reaching inside, he lifted the baby out with both hands. "So this is my brother Mahdi," he shouted happily, holding him high in the air. Binta beamed at his side as she walked toward her hut with the baby in his arms, making faces and cooing and squeezing the plump little cheeks. But Kunta wasn't so taken with his little brother that he failed to notice the herd of naked children that followed close behind them with eyes as wide as their mouths. 2 or 3 were at his knees, and others darted in and out among Binta and the other women, who were all exclaiming over how strong and healthy Kunta looked, how manly he'd become. He pretended not to hear, but it was music to his ears. Kunta wondered where Amara was, and where Lamin was, remembering abruptly that his little brother would be away grazing the goats. He had sat down inside Binta's hut before he noticed that one of the bigger first Kafo children had followed them inside, and now stood staring at him and clinging to Binta's skirt. "Hello, Kunta," said the little boy. It was Suwadu. Kunta couldn't believe it. When he had left for manhood training, Suwadu was just something underfoot, too small to take notice of except when he was annoying Kunta with his eternal whining. Now, within the space of 4 moons, he seemed to have grown taller, and he was beginning to talk. He had become a person. Giving the baby back to Binta, he picked up Suwadu and swung him high up to the roof of Binta's hut, until his little brother yelped with delight. When he finished visiting with Suwadu, who ran outside to see some of the other new men, the hut fell silent. Brimming over with joy and pride, Binta felt no need to speak. Kunta did. He wanted to tell her how much he had missed her, and how it gladdened him to be home, but he couldn't find the words, and he knew it wasn't the sort of thing a man should say to a woman, even to his mother. "Where is my father?" he asked finally. "He's cutting thatch grass for your hut," said Binta. In his excitement, Kunta had nearly forgotten that, as a man, he would now have his own private hut. He walked outside and hurried to the place where his father had always told him one could cut the best quality of roofing thatch. Amaro saw him coming, and Kunta's heart raced as he saw his father begin walking to meet him. They shook hands in the manner of men, each looking deeply into the other's eyes, seeing the other for the first time as man to man. Kunta felt almost weak with emotion, and they were silent for a moment. Then Amaro said, as if he were commenting on the weather, that he had acquired for Kunta a hut whose previous owner had married and built a new house. Would he like to inspect the hut now? Kunta said softly that he would, and they walked along together, with Amaro doing most of the talking, since Kunta was still having trouble finding words. The hut's mud walls needed as many repairs as the thatching, but Kunta hardly noticed or cared, for this was his own private hut, and it was all the way across the village from his mother's. He didn't allow himself to show his satisfaction, of course, let alone to speak of it. Instead, he told Amaro only that he would make the repairs himself. Kunta could fix the walls, said Amaro, but he would like to finish the roof repairs he had already begun. Without another word, he turned and headed back to the thatched grass field, leaving Kunta standing there, grateful for the everyday manner with which his father had begun their new relationship as men. Kunta spent most of the afternoon covering every corner of Jaipur, filling his eyes with the sight of all the dearly remembered faces, familiar huts and haunts, the village well, the schoolyard, the baobab, and silk cotton trees. He hadn't realized how homesick he had been until he began to bask in the greetings of everyone he passed. He wished it was time for Lamin to return with the goats, and found himself missing one other very special person, even if she was a woman. Finally, not caring whether it was something a man should properly do, he headed for the small, weathered hut of old Nioboto. "Grandmother!" he called at the door. "Who is it?" came the reply in a high, cracked, irritable tone. "Guess, grandmother," said Kunta, and he went inside the hut. It took his eyes a few moments to see her better in the dim light. Squatting beside a bucket and plucking long fibers from a slab of baobab bark that she had been soaking with water from the bucket, she peered sharply at him for a while before speaking. "Kunta!" "It's so good to see you, grandmother," he exclaimed. Nioboto returned to her plucking of the fibers. "Is your mother well?" she asked, and Kunta assured her that Binta was. He was a little taken aback, for her manner was almost as if he hadn't even been away anywhere, as if she hadn't noticed that he had become a man. "I thought of you often while I was away, each time I touched the Safi charm you put on my arm." She only grunted, not even looking up from her work. He apologized for interrupting her and quickly left, deeply hurt and terribly confused. He wouldn't understand until much later that her rebuff had hurt Nioboto even more than it did him. She had acted as she knew a woman must toward one who could no longer seek comfort at her skirts. Still troubled, Quinta was walking slowly back toward his new hut when he heard a familiar commotion. Bleating goats, barking dogs, and shouting boys. It was the second Kafo returning from their afternoon's work in the bush. Lamin would be among them. Quinta began to search their faces anxiously as the boys approached. Then Lamin saw him, shouted his name, and came dashing, wreathed in smiles, but he stopped short a few feet away when he saw his brother's cool expression, and they stood looking at each other. It was finally Quinta who spoke. "Hello. Hello, Quinta." Then they looked at each other some more. Pride shone in Lamin's eyes, but Quinta saw also the same hurt he had just felt in the hut of Nioboto, and uncertainty about just what to make of his new big brother. Quinta was thinking that the way they were both acting wasn't as he would have had it be, but it was necessary that a man be regarded with a certain amount of respect, even by his own brother. Lamin was the first to speak again. "Your 2 goats are both big with kids." Quinta was delighted. That meant he would soon own 4, maybe even 5 goats, if one of those nannies was big with twins. But he didn't smile or act surprised. "That's good news," he said, with even less enthusiasm than he wanted to show. Not knowing what else to say, Lamin dashed away without another word, hollering for his Wolo dogs to reassemble his goats, which had begun to wander. Binta's face kept a set, tight expression as she assisted Quinta in moving to his own hut. His old clothes were all outgrown, she said, and with her tone properly respectful, added that whenever he had time for her to measure him between the important things he had to do, she would sew him some new clothes. Since he owned not much more than his bow and arrows and his slingshot, Binta kept murmuring, "You'll need this," and "You'll need that," until she had provided him with such household essentials as a pallet, some bowls, a stool, and a prayer rug she had woven while he was away. With each new thing, as he had always heard his father do, Quinta would grunt, as if he could think of no objection to having it in his house. When she noticed him scratching his head, she offered to inspect his scalp for ticks, and he bluntly told her "no," ignoring the grumbling sounds she made afterward. It was nearly midnight when Quinta finally slept, for much was on his mind, and it seemed to him that his eyes had hardly closed before the crowing cocks had waked him, and then came the sing-song call of the alimamo to the mosque, for what would be the first morning prayer that he and his mates would be allowed to attend with the other men of Jafur. Dressing quickly, Quinta took his new prayer rug and fell in among his kafo as, with heads bowed and rolled prayer rugs under their arms, as if they had done it all their lives, they entered the sacred mosque behind the other men of the village. Inside, Quinta and the others watched and copied every act and utterance of the older men, being especially careful to be neither too soft nor too loud in their reciting of the prayers. After prayers, Binta brought breakfast to her new man's hut, setting the bowl of steaming couscous before Quinta, who just grunted again, not letting his face say anything. Binta left quickly, and Quinta ate without pleasure, irritated by a suspicion that she had seemed to be suppressing something like mirth. After breakfast, he joined his mates in undertaking their duties as the eyes and ears of the village with a diligence their elders found equally amusing. The women could hardly turn around without finding one of the new men demanding to inspect their cooking pots for insects. And rummaging around outside people's huts and all around the village fence, they found hundreds of spots where the state of repair failed to measure up to their exacting standards. Fully a dozen of them drew up buckets of well water, tasting carefully from the gourd dipper in hopes of detecting a saltiness or a muddiness or something else unhealthy. They were disappointed, but the fish and turtle that were kept in the well to eat insects were removed anyway and replaced with fresh ones. The new men, in short, were everywhere, "They are thick as fleas," old Neoboto snorted as Quinta approached a stream where she was pounding laundry on a rock, and he all but sprinted off in another direction. He also took special care to stay clear of any known place where Binta might be, telling himself that although she was his mother, he would show her no special favors, that, indeed, he would deal firmly with her if she ever made it necessary. After all, she was a woman.